Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. So, let me get my book, and also if any of the volume is all off, please let me know in the chat because I'm trying to uh, get it right the first try. So, anyways, we're talking about the Divine Comedy, right? And we all know of the Divine Comedy as being written by Dante Alighieri, uh, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso, Heaven, right? And his journey through uh, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Uh, but before we can actually get into the actual reading of the comedy itself, we have to get into the history behind the comedy and the life of Dante and what actually influenced him to write the comedy and the influences within the comedy itself, right? So, in order to understand the comedy, we have to understand Dante, and in order to understand Dante, we have to understand Florence, Italy. So, let's start with Florence. I won't get into the whole history of it, but Florence was founded in the first century BC as a Roman military outpost. Let's fast forward to, well, actually, no, let's not fast forward. Um, Yeah, sure, why not? Let's fast forward. In Florence, politics was a very heated thing, right? Because at the time, Italy was mostly made up of either papal states or of city-states, such as Venice, Florence, Siena, um, Genoa, stuff like that, yeah? And in Florence, we know that there were two major parties at the time of Dante, and those were the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. So the Guelphs, we don't know the exact founding date of the Guelphs, but it's speculated that at about the year 1140, at the siege of Weisenberg, um, where um the House of Wealth was used as a battle cry, and so they. Well, let's get into the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines were their rivals in a sense, right? So the Ghibellines were also founded um, in 1140 when the Stauffer family, the rival family to the Welf family, used the name of a castle, Wibellingen, which is probably pronounced like Vibellingen. Uh, German stuff, I don't know. I don't know the pronunciation. I'll look it up. Uh, they used that as a battle cry. It was the name of a castle, and then because of the way it was Italianized, Romanized in a sense, that became Ghibellines in the same way that Welf became Guelph. So the Guelphs, they were supporters of the Pope. Um, they typically came from wealthy mercantile families, whereas the um, Ghibellines, they were usually supporters of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, and they were typically from wealthy agricultural families, so most of their wealth came from like agricultural estates and stuff like that. And the reason why this is important is because at the time, the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire were at odds, and they were fighting for control because at the time the papal states still existed, and the Holy Roman Empire obviously existed at the time. And so they were at odds with each other at the time. And so for that reason, the Guelphs typically tended to be based in the areas where the Holy Roman Emperor was more of a threat to local interests because of the fact that they were usually wealthy mercantile families. So you can see that depending on what sort of taxes or edicts the Holy Roman Empire wanted to put out, that would affect the mercantile families more than those wealthy agricultural families. So that's the main cause and the root of that sort of rivalry. So, as we know, Dante was from Florence, and Dante was a Guelph, right? So, in Florence, Guelphs were usually merchants, while the Ghibellines were usually noblemen. And so the rivalry was actually such a heated one that in the year 1260 there was an event called the Battle of Monteperti, and that happened between Guelph, Florence, and Ghibelline, Siena, right? Uh, of course, the Florence and Siena were always kind of rival cities to each other. So if Florence built a cathedral, then obviously Siena would retaliate and build their own cathedral, and tried to make it bigger and better. Um, Although I believe in the most notorious instance of this, the Sienese never actually managed to finish this cathedral, uh, giving a sort of, I guess, victory towards Florence. But anyways, long story short, this Battle of Monteperti. In 1258, the Guelphs, they had exiled all of the notable Ghibellines. So any Ghibellines with power in Florence had been essentially exiled. And so, of course, Siena being the rival city, a lot of them went to Siena or in the surrounding areas. They afterwards the Guelphs murdered the abbot of Vallombrosa, who at the time was accused of trying to help the Ghibellines return to Florence and gain power again. Um, so they had him murdered, and then everything, long story short, like I said, everything kind of came to a boil, and 2 years later, 35,000 Florentines marched towards Siena. The Sienese, they were caught off guard, and so they had to essentially ask for reinforcements. They asked for troops from the king of uh, Sicily, and they were only able to muster a couple thousand troops. So then Farinata, who we will encounter in Inferno, um, managed to raise some more reinforcements to total about 20,000 troops. So the Florentines, 35,000 troops, the Sienese, 20,000 troops, and the Sienese then proceeded to rout the Florentines. And so this is important because Dante was a Guelph. Yeah. So as a Guelph, we can imagine that Dante would be a supporter of the papacy rather than the Holy Roman Empire. But we need to look at it in the time of Dante himself. So by the time that Dante was an adult, by 1300, let's say, the Guelphs had split into black and white, right? So the black Guelphs supported the current pope, Boniface VIII, and the white Guelphs, while general supporters of the papacy, specifically did not support Boniface VIII because of his Ghibelline type, not Ghibelline, but his anti um, white Guelph policies, right? So he basically he was against certain parts of the Guelph party. Um, they didn't support him because of certain things, and so, anyways, by the time 1300 came, Florence was about 100,000 strong, pretty tightly packed city. We have to remember that this was originally a military outpost founded in the Roman Empire. So you can imagine with the expansion from the times of the Roman Empire into medieval times, how the architecture and layout would have changed and how that would have kind of clashed with each other. So, anyways, Dante was a white Guelph, meaning he did not support Boniface VIII. So we're going to see. Well, I won't spoil it, but we're going to learn a bit more about Boniface VIII later in the comedy. So that's a little bit of background on Florence and the sort of general political situation. So we have Guelphs, Ghibellines, white Guelphs, black Guelphs. As a general rule of thumb, Ghibellines and white Guelphs, although they hated each other, did not support the Pope, but the white Guelphs did not necessarily support the Holy Roman Empire either, and the black Guelphs supported the current Pope, Boniface VIII. So, Dante. Dante Alighieri was born in 1265. The exact date isn't known, but the general consensus is that 1265 is the date in which Dante himself was born. He was probably baptized as Durante Alighiero degli Alighieri, so the Durante Alighiero degli Alighieri, so meaning Durante Alighiero of the Alighieri family. And so we don't know much about his early childhood. We have a couple of fragments here and there, but possibly one of the most important things involving Dante and the Divine Comedy is that at age 9, on a May Day party in Florence, he met Beatrice Portinari. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Beatrice for a moment, because Beatrice was slightly younger than Dante. She was born also in 1265, just a couple of months younger than Dante, and she was born to a rich banker. Now, what we have to know here is that Dante came from a kind of minor noble family, whereas Beatrice came from a higher status noble family, right? Think about the difference between like I don't know, like a baronet and a duke or something, right? Baronet and baronet, whatever. Anyways, so we have to remember that sort of difference, right? And we don't know much about her life, but we do know that she was the object of Dante's affection. If you're familiar with the Divine Comedy in any way, you know that Beatrice is a huge part of the comedy. Uh, and she died June 8th, 1290, at age 25. A very young age, unfortunately. So, Dante himself, he claims to have fallen in love at first sight, and let me get my copy of La Vita Nuova, so that way we can actually hear the words of Dante himself on his opinion of Beatrice. So, Dante himself says, she appeared, this is kind of a long passage, so forgive me. She appeared dressed in the most patrician of colors, a subdued and decorous crimson, her robe bound and adorned in a style suitable to her years. At that moment, and I speak the truth, the vital spirit, the one that dwells in the most secret chamber of the heart, began to tremble so violently that even the most minute veins of my body were strangely affected. And trembling, it spoke these words: Ecce Deus fortior me, qui veniens dominabitur mihi, which means, here is a God stronger than I, who comes to rule over me. At that point, the where was I? At that point, the animal spirit, the one abiding in the high chamber to which all the senses bring their perceptions, was stricken with amazement, and speaking directly to the spirits of sight, said these words: Apparuit iam beatitudo vestra, which is Latin for "Now your bliss has appeared." So we can see. Let me skip a couple of lines. Blah blah blah. Let me say that from that time on, uh, love governed my soul, which became immediately devoted to him, and he reigned over me with such assurance and lordship, given him the power of my imagination, that I could only dedicate myself to fulfilling his every pleasure. So basically, Dante says that he's fallen in love with Beatrice and has dedicated himself to that love um, for Beatrice, which is why he refers to love as a person. Unfortunately, as we know, he Beatrice died at age 25. Um, but at age 12, the love, was not meant to be, in a sense, because at age 12 he was promised in marriage to Gemma Donati, who was a family of similar ranking to Dante's own family, and he did eventually end up marrying her. So, although we do know that he was in love with Beatrice, um, as far as we know, he was always faithful to his wife, which is a point towards Dante in a sense, I suppose. So as life went on, Dante he held some notable political offices. most notably a city prior, which is the highest position in Florence. Imagine basically like mayor slash governor slash president of Florence. Uh, a city prior was a weird sort of position in Florence because at the time, city prior was held by 6 individuals. And these 6 individuals, they would each hold a tenure of 2 months, not a tenure, but hold a term of 2 months um, in the year. So obviously 6 times 2 to 12 months. Um, so Dante got his 2 months as the highest position of the city. So in 1301, though, he was exiled from Florence after the Black Guelphs took power. And the Black Guelphs took power, some people believe, through treachery of sorts, through backstabbing, that sort of thing. But this exile is essential to the Divine Comedy. Because in it we can kind of see not only a spiritual journey, well, yes, a spiritual journey, obviously, but we see the spiritual journey of Dante as he's in exile, and in a way he's trying to make sense of this exile, right? So, because he starts writing the comedy in 1301, the same year that he's exiled, and I mean, even the first lines are lines of despair, the lines of in the middle of the journey of our life. Oh, sorry, midway along the journey of our life, I awoke to find myself in a dark forest, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. And so, you can see throughout the entire comedy, even from this sort of despair, the way in which Dante tries to make sense of this exile, such as how can I possibly escape this exile? Um, Coming to grips with this exile and coming to terms with the fact that okay, I'm probably never going to be able to return to Florence, and it's something that's just not in the cards for me. To, I suppose, finding hope, um, such as obviously the belief in an afterlife, right? So obviously Dante was a Catholic, as were the majority of people in Europe at the time. Um, this belief in an afterlife is the kind of hope. And hope is really important in the Divine Comedy because we need to remember that uh, the major themes that we have to remember in the Divine Comedy are faith, hope, and charity. Yeah, so hope is a huge part of the Divine Comedy, and so it was written over a period of about 20 years, 1301 to 1321, and it was all written, the Divine Comedy, while he was in exile. And he never returned to Florence, unfortunately. He died in Ravenna in on September 14th, 1321, uh, 700 years ago, almost to the day. And after that, he's, I suppose, honored as one of the greatest poets to have ever lived, which I agree with, because people were like, "Oh, between Shakespeare and Dante, which one do you think was better?" To which, I reply, Shakespeare is judged by the sum of his works. So Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Much Ado About Nothing, all of his plays are labeled together as like, oh, this is Shakespeare's work. While meanwhile, Dante's greatest work, the Divine Comedy, stands on its own. So if it's able to hold its own by itself against all of the works of Shakespeare, I think that Dante comes out on top. Go ahead, sue me for that. Anyways, um, so let's talk about the influences on the Divine Comedy. Yeah. So the Divine Comedy, it's an original poem, obviously, but Dante draws heavily from a lot of other sources. Most importantly, and possibly most obviously, the Bible. So the Bible obviously is a compilation of texts that um, most people are aware of nowadays. But in back in the day, that was one of the few. It was some of the most. It was literature back then, right? In terms of like the storytelling and stuff, because they didn't have as many books as we have then, so they relied heavily on the Bible for a lot of things. So in Dante's time, um, the Bible was read and understood in a certain way, and we have to understand it in the context that it was read and understood in Dante's time. And by what I mean by that is that in Dante's time and today too, uh, the Old Testament was understood in the way in which it related to the New Testament. So in the like prefigurement in a sense, right? So for example, David, right? Um, he was an ancestor of Jesus and prefigures the role of Jesus as priest, prophet, and king. Yeah. Or Jonah exiting from the whale, or I don't know, big fish, the belly of that prefigures the resurrection. Um, so a lot of things in the Old Testament really do um, prefigure and represent things in the New Testament. And that's the way that it was understood and still is, in a certain sense. So this sort of perspective from Old Testament to New Testament can also be applied to Old Testament or New Testament to current day. Uh, I mean, let's consider, Exodus, for example. Let's think about the significance that Exodus has, um, and how it can be compared to blacks under slavery and Jim Crow, right? So it was that sort of thing. Exodus for blacks and under slavery and Jim Crow could be seen as, oh, we're a people taken out of our homeland and forced to essentially, quote unquote, wander the desert um, for as long as slavery lasted and Jim Crow in the U.S. So Dante, he really makes use of this sort of perspective in his poem um, regarding, uh, you know, talking to people in the Inferno or Purgatory or in Paradise. Uh, we also see that he makes a lot of use of uh, prophecy, right? So obviously we know that in the Old Testament there were, famous prophets. Probably I mean, the most famous is probably Jonah because everybody knows the story of the whale or the big fish, whatever it was, and or Elijah, Elisha, and Habakkuk. There we go. Um, Stuff like that. Um, but Dante makes use of these prophecies because the prophets they don't just foretell the future. It's not like looking into a crystal ball and being like, oh, okay, 50 years from now, you're gonna be exiled and God's gonna be really unhappy because he's just gonna exile you because of that. We A lot of these prophecies are uh, based in history and they're divinely inspired, but they're also like forth-telling, right? And they're unpleasant truths. So let's think about um, the prophecy to King Hezekiah, for example, right? In the Old Testament, Hezekiah, he had just gone around showing I think it was the Babylonians. He had just gone around showing the Babylonians his whole castle, defense, everything in his castle, and the prophet Isaiah, I believe it was, comes up and says, thus says the Lord, and after your time, the Babylonians are going to come. They're going to maybe it was the Assyrians. I can't remember. It was either the Babylonians or the Assyrians. Fact check me on that, yeah. And obviously there's some basis. Like if you look back and you see, uh, and you see that you showed all of your weaknesses to your enemy, obviously they're gonna come and try to invade you and overtake you and all that. And that's the prophecy that the prophet gave to King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah is like, oh, this is great. It's going to be after my time. I don't care. But that's a different story. Anyways, so basically, the way in which Dante uses this sort of style of prophecy in the comedy is that he foretells events in his own life, which at the time of writing have already happened, but in the setting of the story, because the Divine Comedy is set in the year 1300, because of the setting in the story, these events have not yet happened in the uh, timeline of the Divine Comedy itself. So basically, Dante is foretelling his own prophecies, that sort of thing. Give me a second, flip my page here on my notebook. So that's the way that Dante uses prophecy. So next we have to talk about Virgil, right? And the way that Virgil influenced the Divine Comedy. And Virgil was, well, let's talk about Virgil, yeah? He lived during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. Specifically, he lived from 70 BC to 19 BC. And Virgil is obviously most well known for his epic poem, the Aeneid. And so the Aeneid was a sort of framework for, maybe a framework or like model for the Divine Comedy. And a large source. And Dante uses the Aeneid in the comedy, sometimes using a story, sometimes quoting, or sometimes revising even the Aeneid in order to use it for the Divine Comedy. And because we know that Dante was basically a huge fanboy of Virgil, because Dante's guide in Inferno and Purgatory is Virgil himself. So we know that Dante pretty much loved Virgil, loved the Aeneid, and essentially does him homage with his use of the Aeneid in the Divine Comedy. So, the Aeneid, the reason why the Aeneid is relevant, especially to the Divine Comedy, is because it deals with a lot of the concerns that Dante had, whether politically or personally. Because the Aeneid tells the story of Troy, right? We know Helen of Troy, um, and the face that, what was it, set sail to 1,000 ships or something like that. Anyways, so the story of Troy essentially gives an origin story to Rome and can kind of be seen as like a secular exodus, uh, because since as a founding story, we see that uh, empire, because it's telling of the sort of founding of the empire, empire has a direction of sorts, right? Whether that's physically, such as like east to west, or um, or defeat to victory, in terms of like a moral direction, or or like loss to finding new lands, that sort of direction as well. Um, and direction, if something has direction, then if there's something guiding that direction, then it has purpose. And Dante is really, he's really all about the empire because he sees it as a sort of order, right? And so because Dante lives in what was formerly the Roman Empire and is now the Holy Roman Empire, he sees the history of Rome as his own history, and not just history, but an ongoing history. And so in this ongoing history, we can kind of see like a decline of sorts, because Rome um, had sets of laws and was ordered, and then kind of began to fall apart, and that was reordered by Justinian in the 5th century, I believe. And Justinian, if anyone is curious, was the last Latin-speaking emperor of the Roman Empire. And so, where was I? Give me 1 second. Why did this leave? But anyways, yeah, so he sees this as having a sort of order. And because of that, he draws parallels to God because of the order that God has. And the fact that he also draws parallels and believes that um, the fact that the church is based in Rome and that Rome was an empire that had order uh, was kind of divine intervention, divine inspiration of sorts. Um, we also see that apart from this being the founding story of an empire, we see that another one of the concerns uh, that Dante has is what does it mean to be a citizen of sorts, right? So, in, for example, in the Aeneid, we see that the story of Aeneas and Dido, uh, we see what does it mean to be a Roman, right? So in this case, we could see Dante as um, trying to figure out what does it mean to be a Florentine? What does it mean to be a man living in these times, right? If you're not familiar with the story of Aeneas and Dido, Aeneas um, he basically gets into this love affair with Dido. Then he leaves, and Dido commits suicide, right? Uh, and she's also in the comedy. And spoiler alert, she gets sent to the Inferno. And so this is one of the examples of Dante revising the Divine Comedy, as I mentioned earlier, because um, in Dante's afterlife, she goes to hell, literally. In Virgil's afterlife, after she commits suicide, she goes to the Roman equivalent of heaven. And so, moving forward, he obviously knows this story, and well, let's go back to Virgil for that. So Virgil thinks that the notions of love and duty are not compatible, whereas Dante seeks to kind of change that notion because he's aware of the story and he loves Beatrice, but uh, this sort of his love for Beatrice is what drives him towards a higher good, which is his duty in the Divine Comedy. So the geography of the Inferno uh, is taken a lot from Virgil, such as the hell being a pit and a mountain uh, of purgatory, stuff like that. So let's see. Dante also uses a lot of specific incidents from the Aeneid. So, for example, when Aeneas meets his father in the underworld, it's kind of like a renewed sense of motivation to continue his journey. Um, and so Dante needs a similar sort of motivation while he's on his journey, which he will get. I won't spoil it, but he will get it. And finally, the last major influence upon Dante is the Confessions of Saint Augustine. And so Augustine also uses Virgil uh, in order to, I suppose, fuse biblical and classical traditions. So, you have the Old and New Testament, but then you have the philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and all that. And so he tries to combine those. Uh, so I guess because Confessions is a sort of autobiography, although it can be said that the Confessions is a prayer in a sense, because here, let me get my copy of Confessions real quick. Let me take a look. Let me see, where are we? No, not introduction. I need this very first bit. So the very first line of Book 1 of the Confessions by St. Augustine is, "Great are you, O Lord, and exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense, and your wisdom beyond reckoning." And then the very last line, where are we? Where are you? Where are you? The very last line of the very last book of the Confessions is, uh, "Only so will we receive, only so find, and only so will the door be opened to us. Amen." So in a sense, the Confessions can also be said to be a sort of prayer, in the way that it was written. An opening of a prayerful opening and an amen at the very end. So this is also very important because of the fact that it's a sort of spiritual autobiography in the form of prayer in the Confessions, and the Divine Comedy is also a sort of spiritual autobiography. I'm going to give a little bit of spoiler, and I'm going to read the very last line of the Divine Comedy, um, which can also be seen as a sort of closing prayer, uh, a, a sort of awestruck prayer. So the very last sentence of the Divine Comedy is, "At this point, power failed high fantasy, but like a wheel in perfect balance turning, I felt my will and desire impelled by the love, capital L, that moves the sun and the other stars." So we kind of see an awestruck Dante at the very end of the comedy and a sort of resolution to move towards the good, which, I mean, if prayer is not uh, a desire and commitment to move towards the good, then I don't know what is, you know? And some minor influences here and there are the Roman poet Statius and the early Christian historian Orosius. And so that is the sort of background we need in order to actually begin reading the Divine Comedy. So, let's see. It's only been 38 minutes. I think I might actually be able to read the first canto of the Divine Comedy. If anybody's not interested in reading the first canto of the Divine Comedy, then I don't know why you're here. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read the very first canto of the Divine Comedy. And next time we can, yeah, we can read it again and then get kind of into it. So here's kind of like it's only like 4 pages long. Yeah, we can read this and then next time we'll read it again and actually get into the substance of the comedy itself. So, Canto 1. Actually, you know what? Let me get some water first because my throat is dry as hell itself. Alright. So, midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. How hard it is to tell what it was like, this wood of wilderness, savage and stubborn. The thought of it brings back all of my old fears. A bitter place. Death could scarce be bitterer. But if I would show the good that came of it, I must talk about things other than the good. How I entered there I cannot truly say. I had become so sleepy at the moment, when I first strayed, leaving the path of truth. But when I found myself at the foot of a hill, at the edge of the wood's beginning, down in the valley where I first felt my heart plunged deep in fear, I raised my head and saw the hilltop shawled in morning rays of light sent from the planet that leads men straight ahead on every road. And then only did terror start subsiding in my heart's lake, which rose to heights of fear that night I spent in deepest desperation. Just as a swimmer, still with panting breath, now safe upon the shore out of the deep, might turn for one last look at the dangerous waters, so I, although my mind was turned to flee, turned round to gaze once more upon the pass that never let a living soul escape. I rested my tired body there a while, and then began to climb the barren slope. I dragged my stronger foot and limped along. Beyond the point the slope begins to rise, sprang up a leopard, trim and very swift. It was covered by a pelt of many spots, and everywhere I looked, the beast was there, blocking my way. So time and time again, I was about to turn and go back down. The hour was early in the morning then. The sun was climbing up with those same stars that had accompanied it on the world's first day, the day divine love set their beauty turning. So the hour and sweet reason of creation encouraged me to think I could get past that gaudy beast, wild in its spotted pelt. But then good hope gave way and fear returned, when the figure of a lion loomed up before me, and he was coming straight toward me, it seemed, with head raised high and furious with hunger. The air around him seemed to fear his presence, and now a she-wolf came, that in her leanness seemed racked with every kind of greediness. How many people she has brought to grief! This last beast brought my spirit down so low with fear that seized me at the sight of her. I lost all hope of going up the hill. As a man who, rejoicing in his gains, suddenly seeing his gain turn into loss, will grieve as he compares his then and now, so she made me do, that relentless beast, coming toward me slowly, step by step. She forced me back to where the sun is mute. While I was rushing down to that low place, my eyes made out a figure coming toward me, of one grown faint, perhaps too much silence. And when I saw him standing in this wasteland, "Have pity on my soul," I cried to him, "whichever you are, shade or living man." "No longer living man, though once I was," he said, "and my parents were from Lombardy. Both of them were Mantuans by birth. I was born, though somewhat late, sub Julio, and lived in Rome when good Augustus reigned, when still the false and lying gods were worshipped. I was a poet, and sang of that just man, son of Anchises, who sailed off from Troy after the burning of proud Ilium. But why retreat to so much misery? Why not climb up this blissful mountain here, the beginning and the source of all man's joy? Are you then Virgil? Are you then that fount from which pours forth so rich a stream of words?" I said to him, bowing my head modestly. "O light and honor of the other poets, may my long years of study, and that deep love that made me search your verses, help me now. You are my teacher, the first of all my authors, and you alone the one from whom I took the noble style that was to bring me honor. You see the beast that forced me to retreat. Save me from her, I beg you, famous sage. She makes me tremble. The blood throbs in my veins." "But you must journey down another road," he answered, when he saw me lost in tears. "If ever you hope to leave this wilderness, this beast, the one you cry about in fear, allows no soul to succeed along her path. She blocks his way and puts an end to him. She is by nature so perverse and vicious, her craving belly is never satisfied, still hungering for food the more she eats. She mates with many creatures and will go on mating with more until the greyhound comes and tracks her down to make her die in anguish. He will not feed on either land or money. His wisdom, love, and virtue shall sustain him. He will be born between Feltro and Feltro. He comes to save that fallen Italy for which the maid Camilla gave her life, and Turnus, Nisus, and Euryalus died of wounds. And he will hunt for her through every city until he drives her back to hell once more, whence envy first unleashed her on mankind. And so I think it best you follow me, for your own good, and I shall be your guide, and lead you out through an eternal place, where you will hear desperate cries, and see tormented shades, some old as hell itself, and know what second death is from their screams. And later you will see those who rejoice while they are burning, for they have hope of coming, whenever it may be, to join the blessed. To whom, if you too wish to make the climb, a spirit worthier than I must take you. I shall go back, leaving you in her care, because that emperor dwelling on high will not let me lead any to his city, since I in life rebelled against his law. Everywhere he reigns, and there he rules. There is his city, there is his high throne. Oh, happy the one he makes his citizens. And I to him, Poet, I beg of you, in the name of God, that God you never knew, save me from this evil place and worse. Lead me there to the place you spoke about, that I may see the gate St. Peter guards, and those whose anguish you have told me of. Then he moved on, and I moved close behind him. And that's Canto 1 of the Divine Comedy. Not too bad. Anyways, I want to thank you all for actually coming into my first stream um, of talking about the Divine Comedy. I'll put out like some announcements or something the next time I do one of these streams. But if these streams actually grow bigger and you actually do want to donate in the future, all donations, I want to give all donation money to World Villages for Children, because they run like little villages to help uh, poor children, and they try to feed, educate these kids. But once again, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you all again next time.